They called her the least fortunate of the Duke of Penrose's 3 daughters. Plain beside her sisters, invisible beside every celebrated beauty in London. Married off only because a stranger's estate needed saving more than his pride needed a proper match. For 4 months, she said nothing, endured everything, and quietly kept a secret folded into the lining of her own gown. Then came her first night at court, and when the room finally fell silent, it was not for the reason anyone expected. If you believe the quietest woman in the room is often the one carrying the most, drop a comment below with the word strength before we begin. Now let's step inside Colborne Manor. The chapel at Penrose Hall held perhaps 30 guests on the morning Eleanora Vesper became Duchess of Colborne, and even that modest number seemed to strain the goodwill of the room. There were no garlands strung along the pews, no cousins weeping happy tears into lace handkerchiefs, no whispered admiration for the bride's gown. The Duke of Penrose had arranged the match with the brisk efficiency of a man settling an unpaid debt. And in many ways, that was precisely what the ceremony represented. Eleanora stood at the altar in pale gray silk, her spine straight, her hands folded so tightly around her prayer book that her knuckles had gone white beneath her gloves. She had long ago stopped expecting joy from occasions that concerned her. She had learned, instead, to survive them with dignity, which she privately considered a finer inheritance than beauty would ever have been. Beside her, Leopold Ferrars, Duke of Colborne, spoke his vows in the flat, correct tone of a man reciting terms he had already reviewed twice by candlelight the night before. Neither of them looked at the other longer than courtesy required. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, no cheer rose from the gathered witnesses, only the polite rustle of relief that a difficult transaction had finally been concluded. But even as the carriage bearing the new Duchess pulled away from Penrose Hall that afternoon, one elderly aunt murmured to another that she had never in 40 years seen a bride so unmoved by her own wedding, and had never seen a groom quite so determined not to notice. The unkindness had followed Eleanora long before the wedding, though it rarely arrived as a shout. It came instead in the careful pauses of drawing-room conversation, in the particular way certain matrons' eyes would flick toward her and then away, in the nickname that had attached itself to her during her first and only London season 3 years prior. A nickname she never spoke aloud herself, but which she had heard often enough, murmured behind fans, to know precisely how the ton had settled its verdict on her face and her prospects alike. She had not been born plain by any objective measure. She had simply been born beside 2 younger sisters whose fair, symmetrical prettiness made comparison inevitable, and inevitable comparison, in a world that prized inheritance above observation, had calcified into permanent judgment. By the time she was 21, the label had outlived its original cruelty and become something closer to fact in the minds of those who used it. Repeated so often that even Eleanora had begun, in her private hours, to wonder whether it might simply be true. What none of them accounted for, not her father, not the sniggering cousins, not even Leopold himself as he signed the marriage settlement, without once requesting to see her portrait first, was that a woman spoken of only for what she lacked had spent years quietly cultivating what she possessed instead. A memory for figures that unsettled her own governess, a patience that outlasted every insult, and an eye for detail that missed nothing, including things men far more celebrated than she was, had assumed no one would ever notice. Colborne Manor received its new mistress with the cool indifference of a house that had not been asked its opinion. The halls were handsome, certainly, high ceilings, dark polished wood, portraits of Ferrars' ancestors watching from gilded frames with expressions Eleanora found difficult to read as anything but disapproval. Yet for all its grandeur, nothing in it had been arranged to welcome her. Her trunks were carried to a bedchamber in the east wing that adjoined her husband's only by a locked connecting door, and the housekeeper who showed her the rooms did so with the brisk thoroughness of someone conducting an inventory rather than a homecoming. She unpacked her few belongings herself that first evening, refusing the assistance of a maid she did not yet trust to be kind to her, and found herself standing longer than necessary before a window that overlooked the south lawn, where the last of the daylight was fading over grounds she did not yet know how to call her own. The silence of the house pressed against her in a way that felt almost physical, thick with the absence of any voice asking whether she had settled in comfortably, whether the journey had tired her, whether she required anything at all. At dinner that night, conducted in a dining room built to seat 40, Eleanora and Leopold sat at opposite ends of a table so long that ordinary conversation would have required raised voices neither of them was inclined to use. They ate largely in silence, punctuated only by the scrape of cutlery and the occasional strained pleasantry about the weather. And when the meal concluded, he rose, bowed with correct formality, and retired to his study without further comment, leaving her to wonder, not for the first time that day, whether this house would ever feel like anything other than a very well-appointed place to be quietly overlooked. Leopold Ferrars had not married for affection, and he had never pretended otherwise, not even to himself. Colborne's finances had grown precarious in ways his late father's mismanagement had left him to untangle alone, and Penrose's dowry, however unglamorous its accompanying bride, had arrived at precisely the moment his estate required rescue rather than romance. He told himself, in the weeks following the wedding, that Eleanora's comfort was a matter he intended to attend to eventually, once the more urgent business of his ledgers permitted the luxury of attention. He was not, by nature or reputation, a cruel man. Those who knew him described him as fair, if distant, a landlord who paid his tenants promptly, and a master who raised his voice to no one. But there existed in him a carefully maintained wall, built some years earlier around a private grief he discussed with no one. And that wall made itself known most clearly in the small, unconscious ways he failed to see the woman now living under his roof. He did not ask after her interests, did not notice when she rearranged the sitting room's cold arrangement of furniture into something warmer, did not observe that she had begun, within days, to speak with the staff in a manner both kind and unusually direct. Twice that first week, Eleanora attempted conversation over breakfast, once about the estate's autumn harvest, once about a book she had found in his library, and twice he answered in clipped, adequate sentences before returning to his correspondence, entirely unaware that each attempt had cost her more courage than he would have credited her or himself with recognizing. She did not try a third time that week, but she did not stop noticing things about him either, filing away small observations the way she filed away every other fact the world seemed determined not to ask her opinion on. It was during her second week at Colborne that Eleanora discovered the greenhouse at the eastern edge of the kitchen gardens, its glass panes fogged with disuse, its door secured by a rusted padlock that suggested no one had entered in a considerable while. When she asked Mrs. Garrow, the housekeeper, about it, the older woman's expression shifted into something careful and guarded, the particular stillness of a servant deciding how much truth a question deserves. That was Her Grace's greenhouse, Mrs. Garrow said finally, meaning not Eleanora, but the Duke's mother, dead some 4 years now, and volunteered nothing further. Though something in her tone suggested the subject touched a grief the household had collectively agreed not to disturb, Eleanora did not press her. She had learned, across years of being the least consulted person in every room she occupied, precisely when curiosity would be received as intrusion. Instead, she returned to the greenhouse alone the following afternoon, working the stiff padlock loose with patient effort until it finally surrendered, and stepped inside to find the remains of what had clearly once been a flourishing conservatory. Dead vines, cracked pots, a single dried rose pressed flat inside a forgotten ledger left open on a potting bench, as though its owner had stepped away one afternoon and simply never returned. She did not yet know what significance the room held for her husband, nor why its door had been sealed rather than simply locked with an ordinary key. But she felt, standing amid its quiet ruin, the unmistakable sense that she had stumbled onto something the house itself was still grieving, and something told her the reckoning it represented was not yet finished. The estate steward, a narrow, nervous man named Mr. Huxby, had managed Colborne's accounts since before Leopold's father's death, and it took Eleanora less than a fortnight of quiet observation to notice discrepancies in the household ledgers that troubled her considerably more than the cold silence of her marriage did. Sums that should have balanced did not. Payments to tenant farmers arrived weeks late, while certain invoices from London merchants were settled with unusual promptness. She said nothing of this to anyone, not yet certain whether she was seeing genuine irregularity or simply her own unfamiliarity with a stranger's bookkeeping. What she did instead, in the evenings when Leopold remained shut behind his study door and the rest of the house had retired, was quietly assist where she could without drawing attention to the assistance itself. She noticed a scullery maid nursing a burned hand and dressed it herself with salve from her own trunk, rather than summon the busy housekeeper. She noticed an elderly tenant's widow going without firewood through an oversight in the household's distribution, and arranged, through Mrs. Garrow, for the omission to be corrected without ever attaching her own name to the correction. None of these gestures were performed for witnesses. Indeed, Eleanora took particular care that they should not be. She had spent enough of her life being watched and found wanting that the notion of being watched and found generous held little appeal beside the simpler satisfaction of having quietly made something better. But servants notice more than their masters credit them with noticing, and within Colborne's kitchens, a slow, unspoken understanding had already begun to take root. That the new duchess, whatever the ton said of her face, possessed a kindness that asked for nothing in return, which was, in its own quiet way, considerably rarer. The Dowager Duchess Wilhelmina Ferrars arrived at Colborne for an extended visit in Eleanora's third week of marriage, and made her opinion of the new duchess apparent within the first quarter hour, though never in language coarse enough to be called impolite. She corrected Eleanora's seating arrangement at tea with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She remarked, apropos of nothing, that Leopold's first choice of bride, a considerable heiress with a considerably finer complexion, had married elsewhere the previous spring, and that it was a pity circumstances had not permitted a similar match nearer home. "You must not mind me, my dear," Wilhelmina said, when Eleanora's silence following this remark stretched a moment too long. "I only wish my son had married for something more than his ledgers, but I suppose necessity governs us all eventually, and one cannot fault a woman for accepting the terms she is offered, however unequal the exchange." Eleanora absorbed the insult with the same composed stillness she had cultivated across a lifetime of similar remarks, thanked the dowager for her candor with a courtesy so measured it bordered on its own quiet rebuke, and excused herself shortly after to walk the gardens alone. She did not weep, though she permitted herself, once safely beyond the house's windows, a long breath that trembled more than she would have liked. But as she walked the gravel path toward the greenhouse that had become her private refuge, she found herself wondering, with a clarity that surprised her, whether the dowager's contempt might prove easier to bear than her son's continued, careful indifference, and whether either of them yet understood how much of Colborne's survival had already begun, quietly and without credit, to depend on the very woman they had both so thoroughly underestimated. By the start of her second month at Colborne, Eleanora had stopped telling herself that what she noticed in the household ledgers might be innocent oversight, because the pattern had grown too consistent, too deliberate to belong to mere carelessness. She had taken, in the quiet hours after the house settled for the night, to borrowing the previous year's account books from the estate office under the unremarkable pretext of familiarizing herself with her new household's rhythms, and what she found there, laid side by side across her writing desk by candlelight, formed a shape too precise to be accidental. Certain merchants were paid in full and promptly, always the same 3 names, while tenant rents collected on schedule seemed to vanish into categories so vaguely labeled that no auditor without her particular patience would have thought to question them. She worked through the figures the way she had once worked through her governess's most punishing arithmetic lessons, not for pleasure exactly, but because the discipline of it steadied something in her that the rest of her marriage left unsteady, and because numbers, unlike people, did not trouble themselves to disguise their meaning once properly read. Mr. Huxby's signature appeared beside every irregular entry, his hand growing visibly more hurried across the months, as though the later ledgers had been completed in haste by a man increasingly anxious to have them finished and put away. She recognized, with the cold clarity of someone who had spent her whole life being underestimated and had therefore learned to underestimate no one else in turn, that whatever this pattern represented, it was neither small nor finished. What unsettled her most was not the theft itself, if theft it proved to be, but the realization that her husband, a man she had watched sign correspondence, review contracts, and interrogate his tenants over the smallest agricultural disputes, had apparently never once thought to question the very books that governed his own survival. She closed the ledger that night with her candle burned nearly to its socket, and sat a long while in the dark considering what it would cost her, in a marriage already so carefully balanced on cold formality, to tell a man who barely looked at her that his estate steward might be quietly bleeding him dry beneath his own roof. She approached Mrs. Garrow 2 days later, not directly, for directness had rarely served Eleanora well in a household not yet certain how much loyalty she had earned, but through the careful, oblique conversation 2 women use when each suspects the other knows more than she has said. They spoke first of the tenant cottages, then of the harvest accounts. And only when the housekeeper's replies grew noticeably more measured did Eleanora finally ask, in the plainest terms she dared, whether Mr. Huxby had always kept the estate's books so closely to himself, permitting no clerk, no second set of eyes, no oversight beyond his own hand. Mrs. Garrow set down the linen she had been folding with the particular stillness of a woman weighing 30 years of service against a newer, less certain loyalty to a mistress she had only just begun to trust, and when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, as though the walls of Colborne itself might carry the words to ears never meant to hear them. His late Grace trusted Huxby entirely, your Grace, and his Grace has never had cause nor time to question a man his father vouched for. But I have kept this house a long while, and I have noticed things I was never asked my opinion on, which is, I think, a particular understanding you and I now share. It was the first moment since her wedding that Eleanora felt something other than dutiful loneliness pass between herself and another soul beneath that roof, and she recognized it for what it was. Not simply information offered, but a quiet alliance extended by a woman who had watched her long enough to decide she was worth the risk. She did not yet know the full shape of what Huxby had done, nor how deep the deception ran. But she understood, walking back through the darkened corridor toward her cold, adjoining bedchamber, that she was no longer entirely alone in whatever reckoning was coming. And that realization steadied her more than any kindness her husband had yet managed to offer. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, addressed to Leopold in a hand Eleanora did not recognize, but whose confident, looping elegance suggested a woman entirely accustomed to writing to dukes without hesitation, and she happened to be present in the front hall when the post was delivered, close enough to see her husband's expression shift, however briefly, at the sight of the seal. He did not open it before her, tucking it instead into his coat with a swiftness that struck her as more telling than any words he might have spoken, and retreated to his study with the particular haste of a man eager to be alone with correspondence he had not expected, or perhaps had been quietly expecting for weeks. She learned the sender's name only that evening from Mrs. Garrow, delivered with the same careful discretion the housekeeper reserved for every uncomfortable truth she felt obligated to share. Lady Delphine Harrow, daughter of an earl, celebrated across 2 seasons for a beauty the Tun had never tired of praising, and the woman Leopold had, by every account whispered in London drawing-rooms, once fully intended to marry before Colborne's collapsing finances made a wealthier match the only sensible course. The engagement, such as it had informally been, had dissolved without scandal the previous spring. Dissolved, but evidently not entirely forgotten by either party, if the letter's swift, private handling was any indication. Eleanora said nothing of the discovery to her husband, though she found herself, that night, standing longer than usual before the looking-glass in her chamber, studying a face she had spent years being told was lesser without ever quite deciding for herself whether she believed it. She did not weep over Lady Delphine, whom she had never met and could not yet resent with any real conviction. But she understood, with the same clear-eyed patience she brought to Colborne's troubled ledgers, that her marriage now carried a second unresolved account alongside the first, and that both, sooner or later, would require a settling neither her husband nor his household seemed prepared to face. Lady Delphine had not written that letter out of idle nostalgia, and by the time its true purpose became clear, Eleanora would already be standing in the one room in London she had spent years dreading. It was pure accident that brought them together in the library 3 nights later, Eleanora searching for a particular volume on estate management she had noticed during her first week, and only now found reason to consult. Leopold already seated near the cold hearth with a glass of brandy he had not yet touched, staring at nothing in particular with the fixed, distant expression of a man arguing silently with himself. She nearly withdrew rather than disturb him, but something in his posture, a weariness too unguarded for his usual composure, stopped her at the threshold, and before caution could reclaim her, she found herself asking quite plainly whether something troubled him. He looked up, visibly startled that she had asked at all, and for a long moment seemed to consider dismissing the question with the same clipped courtesy he had offered every previous overture she had made. But something in her steady, unflinching patience, the same patience that had outlasted a lifetime of being overlooked, seemed to disarm whatever reflexive wall he might otherwise have raised, and he admitted, haltingly, that Colborne's finances troubled him more than he had let the household see, that figures he had once trusted no longer seemed to balance as they should, though he could not yet say why. Eleanora listened without interrupting, weighing carefully how much of her own discovery to share with a man who had, until this moment, scarcely looked at her long enough to learn the color of her eyes, and decided in the end to offer only enough to invite further conversation rather than alarm. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "the fault lies not in the estate's fortune, Your Grace, but in whoever has been permitted to record it unwatched." It was the longest exchange they had shared since their wedding day, and though neither of them named what had passed between them as anything more than idle evening conversation, both left the library that night considerably less certain of the distance they had spent 2 months so carefully maintaining. Something shifted quietly in Eleanora after that evening in the library, though she could not have named the precise moment it began. Only that she found herself, in the weeks that followed, no longer hurrying past the looking-glass in her chamber the way she had for the better part of a decade, flinching from a reflection she had long ago been taught to distrust. She began instead to look, really look, at the woman standing there. The sharp, assessing eyes that missed nothing. The steady mouth that had learned to hold its silence through 100 small cruelties. The face that London had dismissed as unremarkable, but that seemed, in this quieter light, to carry something the ton's favored beauties had never needed to develop. The particular strength of a woman who had survived being overlooked and emerged from it clear-eyed rather than bitter. She began, too, to take small liberties with her appearance she had never permitted herself before, not from any hope of rivaling Lady Delphine's celebrated beauty, but from a slowly dawning sense that she owed herself, if no one else, the dignity of presenting a face she had stopped apologizing for. She wore her hair differently, in a style that softened rather than concealed her features. She selected a deep green gown from her trunk that she had packed for her wedding and never once worn since, judging it, at the time, too fine for a woman the world had already decided did not merit fine things. Mrs. Garrow noticed the change before anyone else did, remarking one morning, with the particular warmth of a woman who had grown genuinely fond of her mistress, that her grace seemed to be settling into Colborne rather well of late. Eleanora accepted the observation with a small, private smile that surprised even herself, understanding, perhaps for the first time since her wedding day, that whatever else remained unresolved in her marriage and her husband's troubled ledgers, she herself was no longer the same quietly diminished woman who had arrived at Colborne 2 months prior, and something told her that transformation would not remain invisible for very much longer. News from London traveled to Colborne slower than gossip traveled within it, but it traveled nonetheless, carried by visiting acquaintances and forwarded correspondence, and by the 4th month of Eleanora's marriage, the rumors reaching the estate had grown specific enough to trouble even a household as isolated as this one. Lady Delphine Harrow, it was said, had not married the gentleman she'd been briefly attached to the previous spring after all, the match having quietly dissolved under circumstances no one seemed willing to name plainly, and had since returned to society with her ambitions, by every account, redirected toward reclaiming what she had once considered rightfully hers. More troubling still was the whisper, delivered to Eleanora by a distant cousin's letter, phrased with the particular relish reserved for delicious cruelty, that Lady Delphine had begun speaking of Colborne's new duchess in select company, remarking with practiced sympathy how unfortunate it must be for a man of Leopold's standing to have settled for a bride so plainly beneath the company he once kept, and wondering aloud, with false delicacy, whether love matches were simply not destined for men burdened by unfortunate inheritances. The words reached Colborne second-hand, softened by distance, but their intent arrived entirely intact. Eleanora read the letter twice by the window of her chamber, feeling the old, familiar sting of judgment she had spent a lifetime absorbing without complaint, but noticing, too, something new alongside it. A quiet, steady anger that had not been present in her earlier encounters with the ton's casual contempt, an anger that felt less like wounded pride and more like the settled resolve of a woman who had finally grown weary of being spoken of as though she were not fully present to hear it. She said nothing of the letter to Leopold, but she folded it carefully into the same drawer where she kept Huxley's troubling ledgers, understanding, with a clarity she had not possessed 4 months prior, that both matters were building toward a reckoning she intended to meet with considerably more strength than the world had ever credited her with possessing. The invitation arrived at Colborne bearing the seal of the Crown's own household, requesting the presence of the Duke and Duchess of Colborne at a court ball to be held in a fortnight's time, an occasion of sufficient importance that even Leopold, whose distaste for London society had kept him largely absent from its gatherings since his father's death, understood immediately that no plausible excuse could spare them attendance. He informed Eleanora of the summons over breakfast, with visible reluctance, watching her carefully for a reaction he seemed uncertain how to anticipate. Though whether his concern lay with her comfort or with his own dread of the occasion, she could not entirely determine. "You need not fear the evening," he said, in the awkward, formal register he still defaulted to whenever their conversation strayed near anything resembling genuine feeling. "So I will remain at your side throughout." It was, Eleanora noted privately, the closest thing to a protective gesture he had offered her since their wedding day, and she found herself oddly moved by its clumsy sincerity, even as a quieter, more anxious part of her recognized precisely what a court ball would mean. An evening spent beneath the full, assessing gaze of every tongue in London that had ever repeated the cruel nickname she had spent years learning to survive. She thought, too, of Lady Delphine, who would almost certainly be present, elegant and celebrated and eager, by every account reaching Colborne, to remind the assembled court exactly what Leopold had settled for in marrying her. But beneath the apprehension, Eleanora felt something else stirring as well, a small, unfamiliar current of resolve, born of months spent quietly mastering Colborne's troubled accounts, and slowly, privately reclaiming a sense of her own worth that owed nothing to anyone else's verdict. Whatever awaited her at that ball, she decided, folding the invitation carefully beside Huxley's ledgers and Lady Delphine's letter, she would not walk into that room as the same woman London had once dismissed, without a second glance. The days preceding their departure for London passed for Eleanora in a strange, suspended rhythm of preparation and dread, each hour bringing her closer to an evening she had spent years actively arranging her life to avoid, and yet each hour, too, bringing with it a steadier, more deliberate resolve she did not fully recognize in herself, until she caught herself standing before her open trunk, selecting gowns not with the anxious deference of a woman hoping to escape notice, but with the careful, considering eye of someone deciding precisely how she wished to be seen. Mrs. Garrow assisted her in this selection with an unusual gravity, setting aside the pale, unremarkable fabrics Eleanora had favored since girlhood and drawing instead toward the deep, rich blue silk that had traveled with her from Penrose Hall, still folded in its original tissue, never once worn in 3 years of ownership, because she had never before believed herself entitled to wear something so plainly, unapologetically fine. "Your Grace has changed since her wedding day," Mrs. Garrow observed quietly, smoothing the silk across the bed with the same reverent care she might have shown a christening gown. "And I think it is past time the rest of the world was permitted to notice it as well." Eleanora did not answer immediately, turning instead toward the window where the last carriages of the household's preparations were being loaded below. But she felt the housekeeper's words settle into her with the particular weight of truth, spoken plainly by someone who had earned the right to speak it. She thought of Lady Delphine, of the nickname that would surely follow her into that glittering room regardless of what she wore, of every drawing room that had ever measured her against sisters fairer and found her lacking. And she thought, too, of the ledgers still locked in her writing desk, of months spent quietly unraveling a deception her husband's own household had failed to see, and understood that whatever waited for her at court, she would not arrive there with nothing of her own to carry into that silence. She packed the blue silk herself that final evening, folding it with a care she had rarely extended to her own belongings, and beside it, wrapped carefully in a plain kerchief and tucked into the deepest corner of her traveling case, where no curious hand would think to search, she placed the small leather ledger in which she had spent 4 months recording, in her own precise hand, every discrepancy Huxley's accounts had tried to bury. She did not yet know whether she would need it, but she had learned, across a lifetime of being underestimated, that a woman who carried her own proof needed to depend on no one else's willingness to believe her. And for the first time since her wedding, she found herself looking forward to a room full of people who had already decided, long before she entered it, exactly what they expected to see. She packed 2 things into that traveling case no lady's maid ever saw. One was silk. The other would decide her husband's fate before the night was through. The journey to London stretched across 2 full days of travel, the Colborne carriage rattling along roads grown increasingly crowded as they neared the capital, and for the better part of those hours, Leopold and Eleanora sat opposite one another, in a silence that had, by now, grown almost companionable in its familiarity, though it carried, on this particular journey, an undercurrent neither of them named aloud. Leopold occupied himself with correspondence. He did not seem to be reading with any real attention, his eyes drifting repeatedly toward the window and the passing countryside, while Eleanora kept her gloved hands folded in her lap, watching him with the quiet, assessing patience she had cultivated across 4 months of learning to read a husband who rarely offered his thoughts freely. It was somewhere past the midpoint of the second day, as the carriage rolled through a stretch of low hills gilded amber by the late afternoon sun, that Leopold finally spoke without preamble, his voice carrying a rawness she had not heard from him before. "I did not marry you expecting to feel anything at all, Eleanora," he said, staring fixedly at some point beyond the window rather than at her. "I want you to understand that I know how that sounds, and how little comfort it must have offered you these past months. But I find myself increasingly uncertain what I expected has proven entirely mistaken." He did not elaborate further, and she did not press him, recognizing in his halting confession the particular difficulty of a man unaccustomed to admitting error even to himself. She considered several replies and discarded each of them before finally settling on the truth, offered as plainly as she knew how. "I did not expect to feel anything either, Your Grace," she said quietly, "which perhaps makes us better matched than either of our families intended." Something in his expression shifted at that. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. The first genuine softening she had witnessed in his face since their wedding day. And though neither of them spoke again for the remainder of the journey, the silence that followed carried a different texture than the one that had opened it, charged now with something unspoken but unmistakably present between them. Arriving in the capital just as the first lamps of London began to flicker to life against the darkening sky. They arrived at the palace entrance amid a crush of carriages and gowns and glittering jewels, the air thick with the particular perfume of hothouse flowers and candle wax that Eleanora remembered, with an unpleasant jolt, from her single disastrous season 3 years prior, and she felt the old, familiar tightening in her chest as she stepped down from the carriage on Leopold's arm, aware of eyes already turning toward them with the swift, cataloging assessment of a society eager to measure exactly what the Duke of Colborne had brought home to wear his name. She heard it almost immediately. Not loud, never loud, but unmistakable. The low murmur of recognition passing between 2 matrons stationed near the entrance, one leaning toward the other with a whispered word Eleanora did not need to hear clearly to understand. The nickname had followed her, as she had known it would, threading through the assembled crowd with the swift, invisible efficiency of gossip that required no announcement to travel. She felt Leopold's arm tense beneath her gloved hand, and for one unsteady moment feared he too had heard the whisper, and would respond with the same careful, wounding silence he had shown her in their earliest weeks of marriage. Instead, to her genuine astonishment, he drew her fractionally closer to his side, his voice pitched low enough for her alone as they crossed the threshold into the great hall beyond. "Whatever they say tonight, he murmured. "You need not carry it alone. I find I have grown considerably less patient with cruelty than I once was." It was not a grand declaration, nor one he delivered with any theatrical flourish, but it steadied her more than any grander gesture might have, and she felt, walking beside him into a room glittering with candlelight and quiet judgment, the small, unfamiliar warmth of standing somewhere she had once believed herself entirely unwelcome, no longer entirely alone in facing it. But even as that fragile comfort settled over her, she caught sight of a familiar figure across the crowded entrance. Golden-haired, exquisitely gowned in ivory silk, already turning toward them with an expression of practiced, delighted surprise, and understood, with a plunging certainty, that the true test of the evening had not yet begun. Lady Delphine Harrow crossed the crowded hall with the unhurried grace of a woman entirely confident of her welcome, dropping into a curtsy before Leopold so perfectly calibrated between propriety and intimacy that Eleanora understood immediately she had rehearsed this exact greeting many times in anticipation of precisely this evening. "Your Grace," Delphine said warmly, her eyes flicking toward Eleanora with a swiftness so brief it might have passed unnoticed by anyone not watching for it. "How very long it has been. I confess I had begun to think London had lost you entirely to the country." The conversation that followed unfolded with the practiced ease of old familiarity, Delphine recalling shared acquaintances and past seasons with a warmth clearly calculated to remind Leopold, and everyone within earshot, exactly what history existed between them. While Eleanora stood at her husband's side, feeling herself grow steadily more invisible with each exchanged pleasantry, precisely the sensation she had spent a lifetime learning to endure without visible flinching. When the orchestra struck up the evening's first dance, Delphine turned toward Leopold with an expectant smile so confident of its outcome that Eleanora felt her stomach tighten in anticipation of the small, public humiliation about to unfold. But Leopold, to the visible surprise of both women, turned instead to Eleanora, extending his hand with a formal correctness that carried, beneath its surface, something unmistakably deliberate. "I believe this dance belongs to my wife," he said, and though his voice remained even, Eleanora caught the faintest edge of something almost defiant beneath the courtesy. A man drawing a line, however quietly, in front of the one woman he had once nearly chosen instead. She placed her hand in his with a composure she did not entirely feel, and as they moved onto the floor together, she was aware of Delphine's carefully maintained smile faltering by the smallest degree, aware too of the murmurs rippling through the watching crowd, but far more aware of Leopold's hand steady around hers, and of a warmth in his expression she had never once seen him direct toward anyone in that room before. The reprieve, however, proved brief. Delphine reappeared within the hour, drifting toward the small circle of guests where Eleanora stood momentarily without Leopold at her side, he having been drawn away by an insistent acquaintance eager to discuss matters of parliamentary business, and she launched her attack with the practiced subtlety of a woman who had spent years perfecting the art of cruelty disguised as concern. "I do so admire your composure, Your Grace," Delphine said, loud enough to be heard by the small cluster of onlookers who had already begun to gather with the particular hunger society reserves for a promising scandal. "It cannot be easy, marrying a man everyone once expected to marry rather differently. I imagine one must develop a certain thickness of skin, settling for what one is offered rather than what one might have hoped for." The words landed exactly as intended, sharp enough to wound, delivered with enough surface politeness that no one present could accuse Delphine of anything so coarse as outright insult. And Eleanora felt the old, familiar heat rising in her face, the reflexive urge to shrink that had governed her responses to precisely this kind of cruelty for the whole of her adult life. But something had shifted in her these past 4 months. Something steadied by ledgers balanced in solitude and a housekeeper's quiet loyalty and a husband's small, deliberate defenses, and she found, to her own quiet astonishment, that the shrinking urge did not arrive this time with its usual force. "I imagine it is considerably easier, Lady Delphine," Eleanora replied, her voice even and unhurried, carrying just far enough for the gathered onlookers to catch every word. "To settle for a marriage of genuine understanding than to spend one's evenings measuring a happiness one no longer possesses against a woman who apparently still requires an audience to feel secure in her own worth." A ripple of startled silence passed through the small crowd, several onlookers exchanging glances of open delight at the unexpected reversal, and Delphine's carefully composed expression faltered just perceptibly before she recovered herself enough to offer a thin, brittle laugh and turn away. But the exchange had been witnessed, and Eleanora understood, watching Delphine retreat toward a different corner of the ballroom, that the true confrontation of the evening, the one that would determine everything, had not yet arrived, but was drawing steadily, inevitably closer. It arrived not an hour later, delivered not by Delphine directly, but by a broader ripple of conversation that had clearly been building beneath the surface of the evening's polite chatter, gathering momentum as word spread of the exchange between the Duchess of Colborne and Lady Delphine Harrow. A cluster of prominent guests had drawn near enough to observe the Colbornes directly, among them a minister of the Exchequer whose interest in Leopold's estate, Eleanora would later understand, extended well beyond idle curiosity, and it was this minister who posed the question that would determine everything that followed. His tone carrying the studied casualness of a man testing ground he suspected might prove unstable. "I confess I had heard troubling rumors regarding Colborne's finances this past year, Your Grace," the minister said, addressing Leopold directly, but with his gaze flicking meaningfully toward Eleanora, as though the question were somehow intended for her as much as her husband. "Irregularities in the estate's accounts, some concerning discrepancies reaching certain London merchants. I wonder whether Your Grace might reassure us that Colborne's affairs remain as sound as they have always been reputed." The question landed in the small circle of listeners with the particular weight of a challenge dressed as courtesy, and Eleanora felt Leopold stiffen beside her, watched the color drain fractionally from his face as he began, haltingly, to construct some vague reassurance he clearly did not possess the specific knowledge to deliver convincingly. She felt the room's attention shift, subtly but unmistakably, toward the space where husband and wife stood, felt the weight of every watching eye gathering toward whatever answer would emerge from this exchange, and understood, with a clarity that steadied rather than frightened her, that the moment she had unknowingly been preparing for across 4 months of solitary ledgers and careful observation had finally, unexpectedly, arrived. Not in the privacy of her own chamber, but here in the full, glittering silence of the court, where the entire assembled ton stood waiting to see whether the Duke of Colborne's unfortunate bride possessed anything worth listening to at all. Every eye at court turned toward her, waiting for the Duchess everyone had underestimated to fail in front of them all. What happened next? None of them saw coming. Eleanora stepped forward before Leopold could complete his faltering reassurance, drawing the small leather ledger from where it had been concealed within the folds of her gown since that morning's dressing, a decision she had made without fully articulating to herself why she felt compelled to carry it into a ballroom rather than leave it locked away at Colborne. "If Your Excellency will permit me," she said, her voice carrying farther than she had intended, steady and clear enough that the small circle of listeners fell into an immediate, startled silence. "I believe I can offer rather more than reassurance. I can offer proof." She opened the ledger to the pages she had marked months earlier, walking the minister and the gathering crowd through the discrepancies with the same patient precision she had once applied to her governess's most demanding arithmetic, naming the merchants paid with suspicious promptness, the tenant rents diverted into vaguely labeled accounts, the steward's increasingly hurried signature across entries that grew more irregular the longer his deception had gone unquestioned. She spoke without embellishment, without triumph, simply laying the truth before them with the same quiet thoroughness she had once used to mend a scullery maid's burned hand without seeking credit for the kindness. And as she spoke, she felt the room's attention shifting from curious skepticism toward something closer to startled respect. "Colborne's finances are not troubled, Your Excellency," she concluded, closing the ledger gently. "Though they were very nearly ruined by a man both my husband and his late father trusted without question. I have spent 4 months quietly correcting what Mr. Huxby has spent considerably longer trying to conceal." The minister stared at her for a long moment, visibly recalculating whatever assumptions he had carried into the conversation, and beside her, Eleanora felt Leopold turn to look at her fully, his expression unreadable in a way that was entirely different from the careful blankness he had worn for the whole of their marriage. And around them, spreading outward through the gathered court with the swift, unstoppable momentum of genuine astonishment, the room had begun, unmistakably, to fall silent. The silence that followed Eleanora's revelation possessed a texture unlike any she had known in a lifetime of being overlooked, a stillness that belonged not to indifference, but to collective astonishment, spreading outward from the small circle around the minister until it seemed to touch the edges of the entire glittering hall. Conversations faltering mid-sentence as word of what had just occurred, rippled from guest to guest faster than any servant could have carried it. She stood at the center of that silence with the ledger still open in her hands, aware of hundreds of eyes upon her for the first time in her life, not in cruel assessment, but in something closer to disbelief, and found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she did not shrink from the attention as she once would have. The minister recovered first, clearing his throat and offering a bow considerably deeper than courtesy strictly required, murmuring something about her Grace's evident competence and the Exchequer's relief at Colborne's continued soundness, before withdrawing to carry the news of what he had witnessed to whichever corners of the court awaited it most eagerly. Around the periphery of the gathered crowd, Eleanora caught sight of faces she recognized from years of quiet humiliation, now wearing expressions she had never once seen directed at her. Surprise, certainly, but beneath it something that resembled, unmistakably, respect. And even, in one or two older matrons who had whispered her nickname most freely in seasons past, a flicker of something close to shame. Lady Delphine stood some distance away, her earlier composure entirely abandoned, watching the scene with an expression Eleanora could not quite read from across the room, though she thought she recognized in it the particular bitterness of a woman who had built her entire strategy for the evening upon an assumption now thoroughly, publicly dismantled. But it was Leopold's face Eleanora sought first and found waiting for her when she finally turned toward him. And what she saw there, stripped bare of every careful formality he had maintained since their wedding day, struck her with more force than the court's collective astonishment ever could. He did not speak immediately, and for one unsteady moment Eleanora feared his silence carried something closer to wounded pride than admiration, that a man accustomed to managing his own affairs might resent, even now, discovering how thoroughly his wife had succeeded where he had failed to notice failure at all. But when he finally found his voice, what emerged carried none of the guardedness she had braced herself to hear. 4 months, he said quietly, for her alone, though the words seemed to cost him something considerable to speak aloud in so public a setting. You have carried this for 4 months, and said nothing to me. "I did not know how you would receive it," Eleanora admitted, matching his quiet register, aware of the crowd's continued attention even as it began, gradually, to disperse into smaller conversations. A man newly discovering his wife had been managing what he could not see for himself is not always grateful for the discovery, Your Grace, whatever the outcome. Something shifted visibly across his face at that. Not offense, as she had feared, but a kind of dawning recognition, as though he were only now beginning to understand the full shape of the woman he had married, without ever troubling to look closely enough to see her. "I have spent 4 months believing I had married a woman the world considered unremarkable," he said, his voice low enough now that only she could hear it clearly. "And I find I am considerably more ashamed of my own blindness than I have ever been of anything London chose to say about you. You have saved this estate, Eleanora, and I did not even know it required saving until you stood before the entire court and proved it." He reached for her hand then, not with the careful, dutiful correctness he had shown her since their wedding, but with something unmistakably deliberate. And though neither of them spoke further as the orchestra resumed and the ball continued around them, Eleanora understood that whatever distance had defined the whole of her marriage until that evening had, in the space of a single revelation, begun irreversibly to close. News of the evening reached Colborne before the Duke and Duchess themselves returned, carried swiftly by servants and correspondents alike. And the Dowager Duchess, Wilhelmina Ferrars, who had remained behind at the estate rather than endure the journey to court, received the account of her daughter-in-law's public vindication with an expression that shifted over the course of the telling, from disbelief to something considerably more complicated. She had spent 4 months treating Eleanora with the particular cool condescension she reserved for anyone she considered beneath her son's proper due, and the discovery that this same overlooked bride had single-handedly uncovered a deception that might otherwise have ruined the family entirely was not a realization she absorbed easily or with any immediate grace. When Eleanora and Leopold returned to Colborne some days later, Wilhelmina received them in the drawing-room with a stiffness that suggested considerable internal effort had gone into the composure she now presented, and it was several long, uncomfortable minutes before she finally addressed Eleanora directly, her voice carrying none of its previous cool amusement. "I understand I owe you a debt I did not expect to owe," the Dowager said, the words clearly costing her a great deal to produce. "I was wrong in my estimation of you, and I do not offer that admission easily, nor often. Huxby served this family for 20 years, and I confess I would never have thought to question him myself." Eleanora accepted the admission with the same measured grace she had extended to every previous slight, neither triumphant nor overly gracious, understanding instinctively that genuine change, when it came from a woman like Wilhelmina, would need to be demonstrated over time rather than declared in a single uncomfortable afternoon. "I do not require an apology, Your Grace," she said simply. "Only perhaps the chance to be judged going forward by what I do rather than what I was once assumed incapable of." The Dowager studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, before offering the smallest, most unpracticed nod Eleanora had yet seen from her. Not warmth, not yet, but the first fragile foundation of something that might, given time, grow into it. In the quiet weeks that followed, as Colborne settled into the altered rhythm of a household no longer governed by careful distances, Eleanora sat at her writing desk one evening and composed a letter to her 2 younger sisters, still unmarried and living under their father's roof at Penrose Hall, in a tone considerably different from any she had used with them since her own wedding day. She had spent years watching them receive the compliments and attention she had never been offered, had spent years, too, quietly absorbing the assumption that her own worth stood permanently diminished beside theirs, and found, writing to them now, that she carried none of the old resentment she might once have expected to feel. She told them plainly of the ledgers, of the court ball, of Huxby's dismissal, and the slow, careful mending now underway between herself and her husband, not to boast of her own vindication, but because she wanted them to understand, in terms neither vague nor falsely modest, that a woman's value had never been the sum the ton assigned it, however thoroughly the world insisted otherwise. She wrote, too, of Mrs. Garrow's quiet loyalty, of the particular strength she had discovered in herself, only after years of believing she possessed nothing worth discovering at all, and closed the letter with an invitation that they visit Colborne that spring and see for themselves the life their sister had built from what everyone had once assumed was very little. She sealed the letter and set it aside for the morning post, and sat a while longer in the quiet of her chamber, feeling something loosen in her chest that had remained tightly wound since girlhood, a knot of comparison and quiet grief she had carried so long she had nearly forgotten it as a separate weight from herself. Whatever her sister's reply, she understood now that she no longer required their reassurance, nor anyone else's, to know precisely what she had built. But she found, unexpectedly, that she wanted to share it with them nonetheless, not from old rivalry, but from something closer to genuine, hard-won peace. She thought the letter closed an old wound. She had no idea her husband was about to open a door that had stayed sealed for 4 years. It was Leopold who suggested, some weeks later, that they restore the greenhouse together, having noticed, during one of their now frequent evening walks through the grounds, the way Eleanora's gaze lingered on its fogged glass and rusted door each time they passed it. He told her then, for the first time since her wedding, the story the household had spent years quietly avoiding, that his mother had cultivated the greenhouse as her private refuge in the years before her death, and that he had sealed it afterward not from indifference, but from a grief too raw to permit himself to enter it. A wound he had left unattended, in much the same way he had, without realizing it, left his own marriage unattended for the whole of its first difficult months. They cleared it together over the following fortnight, in stolen hours between the estate's ordinary business, pulling dead vines and cracked pots from beds that had lain fallow for 4 years, and Eleanora found in the work something she had not expected, not merely the satisfaction of restoration, but the particular intimacy of building something new alongside a man who had finally, fully begun to see her. The single dried rose she had found, pressed in his mother's forgotten ledger months before, she preserved and framed rather than discarded, and hung it near the greenhouse door as a quiet acknowledgment of the grief that had once sealed the room, and the tenderness that had finally reopened it. By early spring, the greenhouse bloomed again in earnest, roses and jasmine and delicate climbing vines filling the glass room with color and fragrance that seemed, to anyone who had known its years of neglect, almost impossible. And Eleanora took to spending her mornings there, tending the beds herself rather than delegating the work entirely to the gardeners, finding in the slow, patient labor of cultivation an echo of everything she had rebuilt within her own marriage. Not through grand declarations, but through months of quiet, deliberate care that asked for nothing in return except the chance to grow. The following autumn brought Colborne's first grand assembly since Eleanora's arrival, hosted at Leopold's own insistence and attended by a considerable portion of the same society that had once whispered her nickname behind careful fans, though none dared speak it now, not since the court ball's revelation had traveled through every drawing room in London with the swift, thorough momentum such stories carried. Eleanora moved through her own ballroom that evening in the deep green silk Mrs. Garrow had once urged her to pack, her hair dressed simply, her bearing entirely unguarded, greeting guests who had once measured her and found her wanting with the easy, assured warmth of a woman who no longer required their verdict to know her own worth. Leopold remained close at her side for much of the evening, not from the dutiful obligation that had once defined his attentions, but with the unmistakable ease of a man genuinely reluctant to be parted from his wife's company. And when the orchestra struck the evening's first dance, he extended his hand to her before any other guest could claim the honor, murmuring, for her ears alone, that he considered himself the most fortunate man in the room, and had considered himself so for some months now. Though he regretted it had taken him far too long to say it plainly, Lady Delphine, present among the guests but considerably diminished in her former confidence, offered a brief, stiff curtsy from across the room and did not approach again. As the dance carried them across the polished floor beneath the light of 100 candles, Eleanora caught her own reflection in the tall mirrors lining the ballroom's far wall. Not the diminished, overlooked woman London had spent years dismissing, nor even the quietly determined bride who had arrived at Colborne with nothing but patience and a talent no one had thought to ask about, but simply herself, fully and finally visible, standing beside a husband who had learned at last to look at her and see everything the world had so carelessly overlooked. She had not needed the court's astonishment to know her own value, but she found, in this quieter, warmer room, that being truly seen by the one person whose regard she had genuinely come to want was a different, deeper kind of vindication altogether, one she intended to hold on to for the whole of the life still waiting ahead of them. If Eleanora's story reminded you that quiet strength always outlasts loud judgment, subscribe to Dukedom Stories so we can keep bringing these women the endings they deserve. Tell us in the comments. Was it the ledgers or the greenhouse that won you over? See you in the next story.